I want to remember this time to thank the Mansfield Center, but in this particular case, even more so, the Molly people, a name I particularly like, Molly, for helping to do the details and make sure you and others knew that this was going to be a two-afternoon public lecture. A couple of reminders off of our last get-together. I had mentioned the sort of the table of contents for what I was going to talk about, and that was the early history, you know, the fear of what was in the unknown. We visited about that a little. The early congressional legislation of a number of protections that the Congress passed, and I just sort of listed them off fairly quickly. And then the first wilderness bills took a long time to pass wilderness. The guy credited with, and I've never, maybe some of you have researched this to see if it's absolutely accurate, but the guy that a great many people, not just in Montana, give credit for writing the first wilderness bill was Senator Lee Metcalf of Montana. Do any of you remember Lee? How many of you remember Lee? Yeah, terrific. Lee was what Mike Mansfield used to say about him. Lee was America's greatest U.S. senator. That's how Mike described him. And if you look at the stuff Lee got done and how true he was to Montana, I think Mike was right. Then I said we would just share with you some wilderness facts, which I want to reshare again, because it's good to have a spiral learning process and update on what you've already heard. So I'll just give you those wilderness facts in a hurry again, and then I frankly don't remember whether we talked about Congress and the committee system. Did I go over how all that worked with you? Did I? The really smart people are nodding yes. The rest of us can't remember, including me, whether we did it or not. Okay, so the kind of how a bill becomes a law. You okay with that? Did we do that a little bit? Not to any real degree, huh? Okay. I didn't think so. I think I touched it. And then I started, I sort of skipped that inadvertently, I thought, and I guess I did from what most of you are saying. That is the sort of how a bill becomes a law, and a quick review of that process. That's a semester-long course, too. So we do it in a couple of minutes here. And then what I did get into was the beginning of the now 30-year effort that I was involved in after rare roadless area review, roadless area review and evaluation came to the Congress. It had to decide what areas it was going to delegate into wilderness and what areas it was going to release to the Forest Service to do what they could do under their environmental rules. That matter has been a tremendous struggle. And I went through the Dillon hearing with you, and then the Missoula hearing that followed, and my introduction of a bill to declare wilderness and recreation area up in the Rattlesnake. So we got sort of that far. Let me again go through the fact that we're only talking about federal land in these lectures. So the land you own. Now you own state land too, but we're not and you own your own land, but we aren't discussing any of that. This lecture is about, and all wilderness lectures virtually are about federal land. And the Congress, which in 1964 passed the Wilderness Act, and in it dictated that only the Congress could designate wilderness. Not courts, not presidents, just the Congress. And that's the way it's been. And they did that legitimately because they wanted you to have a hand in it. You don't have much hand in the courts. You don't have much hand in the presidency, but you do in the Congress. You can make the Congress do things. So they said, let's let that belong to the people through the House and the U.S. Senate. When the first wilderness area was passed, there were 54 areas. 54 areas declared wilderness in America, and that was 9 million acres. Now, there are 758 areas. So we've gone from 50 plus to 750 plus, and we've gone from 9 million acres to 110 million acres of wilderness. That sounds like a lot, I know. It's a very small portion of the land base in the United States, your land, very small portion. And half of that 110 is in Alaska, as I mentioned. Of that 110, 3 million of it is a little over 3 million is here in Montana. And of that 3 plus, it's about 3.4. Of that 3 million acres, half of that is in one place, the Bob Marshall complex with the Great Bear included in it. Okay? There are 557 wilderness areas in the West, here in the mountains with 49 million acres. Let me talk a minute about the Congress. Every legislative body virtually in the world specializes. They have to, well, let's do it this way. I got elected to Congress. I mean, yeah, I went to school here and a couple of other schools, and I'm a working guy from Butte and liked politics, got elected to Congress. So I say to students, look, if I did this, you can do this. Now you got to have luck, you got to have timing, and you got to be willing to work at it. But you can do it. Everybody in Congress looks around the first year they were there, and when I was there, they see, you know, people like Tip O'Neill and say, wow, I wonder how I got here. And then after they've been there for 2, 3, 4 years, or 2, 3, 4 terms, they look at everybody else and say, I wonder how the hell they got here. I know how I got here, but how the hell they got here? So you get to Congress. Now suddenly you're elected on that second Tuesday in November. You wake up the next morning. Here's what happens to you. Your eyes flash open and you say, holy crap, I'm Montana's congressman. Pretty soon I'll be sworn in. It's a spectacular feeling. It was for me. And then I got frightened by it. Because you see, the only thing I knew that morning that I didn't know the morning before, the only new thing I knew, even though I was a member of Congress and supposed to know everything, was that I got elected. That's the only new thing I learned, probably, that day. And it wasn't all that much. I didn't know all that much. And most members of Congress that I know came there, particularly in the House. I can't speak closely about the senators, but particularly in the House, they came knowing their own business. You know, whatever they were, teacher, lawyer, owner of a company, whatever they did, radio announcer, garbage man. I served with the garbage man. Sheriff, I served with the sheriff. You know, just common people like all of us. The only thing they really knew about was their occupation, their life. Not sure they paid attention to a lot of things. It's part of how they got elected. They could debate and they could stand up to questions, so they paid a lot of attention. You have to do that. But they had 1 or 2 specialties, and that was it. Can you learn everything can you become a specialist in everything the Congress has to deal with? No, you're not smart enough. Nobody has that kind of a memory. Plus, you can't be everywhere at once in the Congress. You can't get to all the committees. You can't do all the things you need to know. So you have a staff to help you, and you have a Congressional Research Service that will go find out whatever it is you want them to find out. They write you a memo or they come and see you. But where you really learn, I was looking around to see if there's a writing board, but it's okay. where you really learn is in the committees, right? So I got on the Natural Resources Committee. Back in those days it was called Interior. So I got on the Natural Resources Committee, and then because I was a teacher, I got on the Education Committee. Those were my two committees. There are about 25 people on the committee, each committee. You can't always get your first choice. But the committees I wanted, I was able to do that, and a lot of members can get their first choices unless they want something like the Tax Writing Committee or the Appropriations Committee. Then you have to wait in turn. And I never did try for those committees, by the way, because I had seniority on the other committees. Okay, now on the committee, there are subcommittees. And the subcommittees is where Congress does its specializing. So let's use, for example, education. Somebody shout out something that would be under the, something concerning education that the federal government has some authority over. Title IX. There's a committee. It's not called the Title IX committee, but there's a committee and Title IX is in it. Elementary and secondary education, it's called. Somebody else.
Special ed.
Special ed. There's a committee called, when I was there, Special Ed. Subcommittee, I mean, okay? Let's say post-secondary education, where we are now. There's a committee for it. Same thing in agriculture. You know, there's a soybean committee. When you say that out in eastern Montana, they say, well, there ought to be. And so it goes. And you have to be a member of the full committee to be on the subcommittee. And the subcommittees have, 11, 12 members. So let's say this is the dais in the Congress, and this wooden front piece goes all the way to that door and all the way to that wall. And then there's a step, and there's another podium. And that's the one that the speaker stands behind, or the thing you've seen most often probably is that's where the president comes to deliver the major messages, State of the Union and so on. Okay? And that's one step up. And you've seen this. You've seen this long, beautiful wooden feature, and all these people sitting at it, the parliamentarian, the assistant parliamentarian, the clerk, and so on and so forth. A fellow from Montana named Ed Smith, who's now the clerk of the Supreme Court in Montana, used to be the clerk of the House. I managed to get Ed that job. So he was sitting there, Montanan up front. And then the speaker's back here. And right over here, I'm just trying to give you the picture of it. Right over here at the end of this beautiful wooden series of, it's like one piece, but it's a series of desks, is a brass fitting. And attached to that brass fitting is a wonderful walnut box. So you get elected to Congress and you decide people are on you and they want with rattlesnake and wilderness because it's Missoula's water back then. Main source for Missoula's water. So you write up a bill. If you're not an attorney, and I wasn't, you get help writing it up. But you write up a bill and you go over it and over it and over it. You talk to people, talk to the city council, talk to the mayor here, talk to different people on the motorized recreation side that didn't want it in wilderness. Talk to people that do want it in wilderness. So finally you come up with a bill to put the rattlesnake in wilderness. You bring the bill in the House chamber and you drop it in that box. And the parliamentarian sitting here, if you've been around long enough, he'd call you by name. Hey, Mr. Williams, how are you? And then he puts it in his drawer. And at the end of the day, he and the speaker, or a speaker's assistant, sort through all the bills. Oh, that new guy from Montana, Williams, put in a bill for wilderness out somewhere in Montana. That's cool. Well, we'll send that over to the Natural Resources Committee. he ought to be able to get something done with that because he's on the Natural Resources Committee. So they put it in, a box, right, a little wooden box that says Natural Resources on it, and that night or the next morning, the chairman of that committee comes by, takes those, and looks at all the bills that have been introduced that day for the natural, that are under the jurisdiction of the Natural Resources Committee, and he decides what subcommittee they go to. So the speaker, in effect, decides what full committee they go to, and the full committee chairman decides what subcommittee they go to. And then so they're put in his box, and he comes by, the chairman of the subcommittee, I used to be one of those, he comes by and says, oh, a bill for wilderness, that's the first bill that Williams has put in. First time we have a wilderness bill in a while, okay, rattlesnake. I wonder why they want to protect rattlesnakes. Well, anyhow. And then the chairman gets together with the full committee chairman, and they say, what do you think of this bill? And they decide whether this bill is ever going to get a hearing. Two people, full committee chairman and the subcommittee chairman. Now you can force it. You can try to force it. But in those days, if the full committee chairman and the chairman didn't want it, didn't even want to hear it, and you forced a vote on it, your parking lot will be, your parking space will be out in Alexandria, Virginia somewhere. Or worse. Come on in, folks. No, it's not quite like that, but you don't press it too much. You have hearings on the bill at subcommittee, might have hearings in Montana or wherever, right? And it takes a long time. And then there's an amendment process that goes through. The bill's in the subcommittee. Any member of the subcommittee can offer an amendment. And my friend from eastern Montana in those days when I first got elected was Ron Marlinay. And Ron was very good about it. He was not a wilderness advocate, but he wouldn't fuss with things that were not in his district. In those days, Montana had 2 districts. And Ron and I were both on the same subcommittee. And I must say, he was really good about it. And the anti-wilderness people were always after him to amend it, to allow snowmobiles, or to kill it. And he'd say, not in my district. So Pat represents that district. So he had a little seniority on me, and that was great. That was to Ron's credit. He never got much credit for that sort of thing, but that was to his credit. If the bill passes, it goes up to the full committee, which in this case is Natural Resources. Natural Resources. And it goes through hearings there. But it's up to the chairman whether he wants to have them or not, unless you force a vote. And usually on this sort of thing, they're pretty good about it. The one issue I found, all the years I was in Congress, one issue where a member of Congress had absolute authority, virtual authority, was on wilderness. Now it's true a chairman might get in your way, but normally not. They would say, this is that person's district, that person's responsible to the constituents. If they don't like it, that person won't come back. If the constituents do like the wilderness, you probably will get reelected, but we're going to leave it up to them. So other people in the Congress, while they had ability to vote no, they had ability to amend it. If they went to the leadership and said, I want this bill killed, the leadership would say, hey, this isn't in your district. Wilderness had that kind of an importance to it. It was very interesting. It was the only absolute raw authority that I ever felt I had. Even when I was chairman of a subcommittee, I didn't have the kind of, raw political clout that you have over moving a wilderness bill along. The bill would go through hearings and whatnot, and then it would come to the floor of the House. If everything went well, it'd come to the floor of the House, and the floor of all the members of Congress, 435 in the House, would have a chance to amend it any way they wanted. Couldn't stop them. They could amend it. Everybody had a right. I amended a lot of other people's bills, not wilderness, but other kinds. And then it'd come to a final vote. And sometimes it'd take an hour, sometimes it'd take a week on one bill. But it'd come to a final vote, and everybody gets to vote on it. If it If it dies, it's a goner. Unless you can parliamentarily bring it back, it's a goner. If it passes, it goes over to the Senate, and it goes through precisely the same process. Right? It's not reintroduced, but it lays on the table in a box that says natural resources. They all have to decide if it goes there, and then what subcommittees, and they go through exactly the same process all over again. If it passes and it's identical in the House and Senate, it goes right to the President. If it's different, there are different amendments in the Senate and in the House, then it goes to what's called a conference committee that is just made up of 5 or 6 people that had the most interest in it, and always the author. And basically, that's how a bill becomes law. And of all the bills I passed, and some bills that failed, including wilderness bills, we'll talk about that, the magic in the system and why it worked was from the day I got there till the day I left beyond me. I couldn't figure it out. It's magic. It's legacy. It's understanding. It's friendships. It's, in this case, Montana. And I would have people say to me, members of Congress say to me, you know, I went to Montana once. We were driving to Yellowstone. I was a little kid. And my dad got a flat, and 4 people stopped to help us outside of Mammoth, this one guy. And so he'd say, this particular guy said, so I don't agree with you much, Pat. You're a Democrat and I'm a Republican. But if your people elect you and they think this is right for Montana, I love Montana so much I'm going to vote with you on it. Well, hell, you wouldn't find that for any other issue. But you would for wilderness. It was magic. And there was magic in passing any bill. Somehow the founders developed a system that works, and not just because it works with the process of parliamentarism. I say that right? But it works because of trust. And that magic of somebody having gone to Yellowstone in the case of wilderness or clean water or clean air or that, right? Not to say it's all romance, because some of it's really hard-knuckled, but it's magic. That's all I'll say about. I'm going to ask if you have any questions, but that's all I intended to say to you about how a bill becomes a law. It's not as difficult as people think. Any questions? It's a pretty slick process, and it moves pretty easily. And members of Congress become specialists in their subcommittee and their full committees. They really get to know a lot about it after a while. Yes?
Does wilderness still have that same special status in today's Congress?
Well, not being there, I'm not sure. And I noticed that the tester bill has languished a very long time. But I would think so, because it seemed to me it was so deep in the Congress that it's probably still like that. I think so. Yeah, I think so. A member of Congress may say, boy, that's wrong, but it was that way when I was there. Arnold ever talk to you about the way Congress works? Hey.
I think that what you said is true, that the people have a natural affinity for Montana if they've ever been here. And it doesn't matter where they're from. And they talk then as if they have a piece of it and they own a piece of it.
Yeah.
So wilderness benefits from that.
Oh, cool. Yeah. If some of you remember a fine congressman that was elected in 1960 and served for 4 or 5 terms, long time, named Arnold Olson. Remember Arnold? That's his daughter. That's his daughter. She's kind of come out today. She knows as much about this as I do. Anybody? Please.
The committees are The committee membership is still based on the majority versus the
Yes.
minority.
Right.
So it's 7 to 8 or
Right.
whatever. So you could have 8 Republicans saying no at the subcommittee level, and they would still lose. I mean, that, unless, and then there may have been some votes switched or bought or sold or whatever.
Well, I don't think bought or sold, but whatever, yeah. Yeah, that's right. The majority in the Congress, and there's lots to talk about in the Congress, but the majority in the Congress, right now the House is, has a Republican majority that's very significant, and the Senate has a Democratic majority that's very, very slender. And November elections will decide whether the House stays Republican, which it almost certainly will, and whether or not the Senate stays Democrat, which is a toss-up. And most pros say no, the Senate is going to become Republican, most of the opinion polls and whatnot. But they all say it's too close to no. Whoever controls that body, and we're talking in these lectures about the House, whoever controls that body, in this case Republicans, also have the majority on all committees. And so it's a lock. You have a lock if you're in the majority. And there's been a lot of complaint about that. Many political scientists think it shouldn't be that way. I tend to think it should. It's not perfect, but hey, if America wants a Republican House of Representatives, then because this, how a bill becomes a law, is so tightly fit together, it's seamless. I don't think you should break it up by saying, well, the subcommittees have to be of the other party, or the full committees have to be of the other party. I tend to think we'd get too much gridlock that way. I know it does. It sounds counterproductive, but.
Pat, you mentioned, and I noticed in the state legislature too, if you have the majority, you have the chairmanships of the committee too.
Right.
And you said those two guys decide a lot of stuff.
Right, and they are of the majority party in both the legislature where you served, Mr. Fleming, as well as in the Congress. Same thing, yeah. Yes.
Would you repeat the questions?
Sure, I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah. It won't be much clearer when I repeat the questions, but at least you'll know what they were talking about. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Do you think that we over-legislate ourselves, and how is it prevented to not do that?
Over too many bills? Yeah, well, it seems to me we either have too many or not enough. When I was there, we were accused of too many. We were doing too many things. At one time in my life, I worked for Hubert Humphrey. And people used to say, Humphrey has more solutions than the country has problems. That may be true of the Congress. Now, today's Congress, we have problems. We have immigration that we've got to get solved. We've got these wars, or whatever the hell they are, that we've got to figure out whether we're in or out. And there are many, many other problems, including continually trying to fix education and whatnot. And right now, we're not satisfying any of those needs. So, in my opinion, now we're under-legislating. When I was there, I constantly would hear from people who I think probably, if there's a left and a right in politics, you know, that were on the right, who always said, quit legislating. Well, now that there's a Republican majority in the House, they've gotten their way. We have stopped legislating. But it seems to me we got to continue it. It's just that we can over-legislate. I think we can do that. We can get nanny government. You know, we start protecting us from ourselves. And a lot of people support that kind of government. I'm a little leery of it myself. But anyone else? Okay. You sure? Okay. Some people are hesitant, but see how I take care of what I said last time and fit it into this. I compared Montana's wilderness with other states. If you remember, they had 3 million, we have 3 million, another state had 4 million, and so on. Let me, in 1964, when the Wilderness Bill was passed, here's a list of the areas in Montana that that Lee Metcalf, Arnold Olson, and Jim Batten got into the bill, put in the bill, areas that said these have to be in the first wilderness bill. We know, of course, about the Bob Marshall. There was Bear Trap Canyon, if you've been down there, Taylor Hill Guard, Spanish Peaks, and the additions down between the Gallatin and Lone Mountain, Cabin Creek, Monument Mountain. Am I forgetting any? I think that's it. Let me go back to the combative politics that began with the arrival of that roadless area review and evaluation that came first to the President and then to the Congress, recommending X amount for wilderness and X amount to be released in every state that had those characteristics in the landscape. The fight began when that document arrived on Capitol Hill, and it happened to arrive the same time I did, 79. Combative politics became the rule with regard to whether or not Montana should have more wilderness. Other states were involved in it too. But the combative politics here in the Northern Rockies was more severe. I don't know how to describe it except to say it was pretty bare-knuckled. And here's why. I mentioned to you the Berkeley Pit, I think, and my wife Carol's brother, who operated this big shovel that could pick up this room in 2 scoops. That was 300 miners out of work, right? Mining wasn't going away. Miners were going away. Not mining, just the miners. Because productivity meant you could cut more timber, and you could mine more copper, and all the rest of it, with fewer people. So the workers were going away. And that panicked states like Montana that were natural resource states. And that started happening 5, 6, 8 years prior to 1979, 1980. The panic was setting in. And along comes this idea of let's have more wilderness. Well, the companies said, well, that'll put people out of work. That'll put miners out of work. Well, they'd been putting miners out of work for 10 years. That'll put miners out of work, and it'll cut into our profits, and there are trees out there we should get, and there's gold in them, they're hills, and Montana is ora e plata, gold and copper, right on its advertisement, right? Shouldn't happen. And boy, here it comes. And those of you who remember it recall that probably a week didn't go by for quite a number of years when you'd pick up the Missoulian or whatever Montana paper in the western Montana, you read in those days, the Flathead paper, wherever, that there wasn't a front page story about wilderness and losing jobs if that's what was going to happen. Right? I didn't have a lot of economic or political foresight when I was in the Congress, but I had enough to understand this, and that is that the Rocky Mountain West was going through something that we didn't yet recognize, and that was an enormous transition from one way of life to another. The day was coming when timber and mining were no longer going to be king. It was going to be, we haven't, as I mentioned to you last time, we haven't figured out what to call it yet, but it's like a conservation economy. I don't like to call it a tourist economy because it sounds like you're making money flipping hamburgers. It's a hell of a lot more than that. And it was coming, and you could hear it, you could smell it. And so I thought, yeah, protecting these lands is not only going to be good for habitat, for watershed, for scenic views, for hunting and fishing, which Montanans take damn seriously, but it's going to meet the new transition. It's going to mean a better economy and more jobs for Montana. My brother-in-law's shovel was not going to go away. Wasn't going away. Those jobs weren't coming back. But outfitting, I see smoke, outfitting, guiding, tourism, fly fishing shops, increase in enrollment in the universities, and on and on and on. Jobs piled upon jobs were going to be here. But we had to protect the place as part of that evolution. And so I decided to join the fray, to join the combat, but on the side of trying to protect the place and encourage that economy that was coming down the road. Montanans changed political preferences. In mining towns where you had a lot of workers that were organized into unions, not the unions, but some of the workers started to say, we're not sure we're Democrats anymore. Because Democrats were on the environmental side and they were pushing, they said, we're not sure anymore. Go through the, if you have a mind to, go through the votes up in Libby and Lincoln County for whatever it was, 6 decades or more. That was a heavily Democratic vote up there. And it had to do with the fact that the workers were organized. That started to slide away during this combative time. And Libby hasn't voted, and hey, it's all right. I mean, people get the right to vote how they want. But Libby hasn't voted, and Lincoln County haven't voted Republican for a very long time now. But they did for 5 or 6, 7 decades. Then this transition, this evolution came along, and suddenly Republicans weren't the environmentalists, Democrats were the environmentalists. And I'm not sure how all that happened except for corporate wishes and tendencies. But old coalitions changed. Miners began to get along with ranchers. Not a common coalition before this, but now they both had something to be against. Outfitters began to join coalitions with people that they hadn't dealt with all that much before. Small businesses that were on their side, the outfitter's side with regard to wilderness. So the coalitions, the economic coalitions began to shift in the 1970s and the 1980s, and you could hear the political ground literally cracking. By the way, organized labor did not oppose wilderness bills. I want to be sure to mention that. I know there are a few people here that have been, and a couple of still are, members of some union or other. Organized labor never opposed wilderness bills, which was to, in my opinion, which was to their credit, because a lot of their members opposed it. Maybe not a majority of their members, but a hell of a lot of their members opposed it vociferously. And in some places, organized labor no longer represents loggers and miners, and part of it was this break. People say, what happened to organized labor? Well, that's a part of it. It's only a part of it because, the diminution of organized labor went on in a lot of places around the country, so it just didn't happen to do with Montana. The rattlesnake wilderness, I mentioned to you, we went to Dillon and we had that very tough hearing, and then Mo Udall agreed to come back, and we came here to Missoula and had a nice, there was protesters there, particularly snowmobile protesters, but we had a really good hearing on, that was very supported by witnesses, had a good hearing here on whether the rattlesnake should be wilderness. And there's 60,000 acres up there, about a little over 60,000 acres that you can, a lot of which you can see out your window or walking down the street here. There was a considerable objection to bringing by some members of the Montana delegation, considerable objection to naming it all wilderness, because if you've been up there, you know that what is now the recreation area comes right down to people's yards, right? And you don't want to put a wilderness boundary where people are inadvertently going to violate the law by driving a car into it as they're turning around trying to get to their house, right? You don't want to do that. So we declared, after a lot of argument and concern, we declared the top 30,000 acres, the higher country, the top 30 wilderness, and then we just said, you know, the Congress can do what it wants on this stuff, so we said the bottom won't be wilderness, but it will be protected by the Forest Service under kind of a semi-wilderness, and we'll put in how it has to be protected in the law, and we'll call it a national recreation area. So the area most of you have gotten into in the Rattlesnake is not the wilderness area, it's the national recreation area. You got to go up another 5-6 miles or whatever it is I've been up there many times, but I don't know how far I walked, to get to the wilderness area, and then all that high country is in there, and it slops over in the back that you can't see. I got that passed really quickly as a freshman. And I did because of that magic thing that goes on back there, and plus the Montana connection. So we passed that bill, and it was signed by Jimmy Carter. Trying to figure where to go next with regard to the time available. I've considered this in my kitchen for quite a while over the week, but it's hard to leave things out, and I have to leave a lot out here. You know, the key, I think, to good teaching, I don't get there very often, the key to good teaching is to figure out what to put in and what to leave out. If you get the right things in, you're pretty good. In 1984, jumping from 81 to 84, there were things that went on during 81, but not, most of it was talk between the members of the delegation. In 1981, excuse me, 1984, Senator Melcher, Senator Baucus, who had left the House a few years earlier, and that's the seat I won. So Senator Melcher and Senator Baucus, Congressman Marlene from eastern Montana, and myself, the line ran to separate the two districts. The line ran from Canada to Wyoming, this side of Cascade County, this side of Great Falls, okay? All the way down. And we decided to introduce a bill. Other states, by a couple of dozen or 3 dozen other states, had already introduced bills based on what are we going to do about this rare proposal that's come to us. We got to do something. And the reason we had to do something was because the courts said, federal courts decided, that all of the land that was studied, all of it, not just what was declared or what was suggested as wilderness by the Forest Service, but all the land they had studied under rare, we would be under, I'm going to oversay this a little bit, but would be under court, federal court, lock and key. And you couldn't do anything with it. Well, there was more land under lock and key that had ever been proposed for wilderness. So people panicked, including people that were right. Now they were going to lose their jobs. And they were, I think some of them were essentially correct about that. So the Congress started to act quickly. Said, wow, all this land's locked up. Let's decide what's going to be wilderness. And then in that bill say, and all the other lands that had been held by the courts are now released to the Forest Service. Okay, so we had to move. And So the four of us agreed on a bill, and here's what it had in it. The Forest Service had suggested under RARE that about 600,000 acres of Montana be wilderness. That's my recollection, about 600,000. The delegation looked at it, talked to the Forest Service, came out here, talked to dozens and dozens of people, and put in a bill with 850,000 acres of wilderness. 850,000. We decided that there were 400,000 acres that didn't quite have wilderness potential. They were like that bottom end of the rattlesnake. They should be protected, but maybe not with wilderness. Maybe allow bikes in there, for example, or occasional tree harvest for elk habitat. We had 850,000 acres of wilderness and 400,000 acres like the National Recreation Area and the rattlesnake. We called it special management areas. Forest Service really dislikes that because they don't know how to manage it. I mean, understandably. And then we said, and of this land that could be released, we're going to hold another 250,000 of it for what we called further study, and that is courts, don't let it go after this bill passes, hold it, because it may have wilderness potential or other potential, and we frankly haven't had time to find out. And so all told, we were holding up about 1.3 million, 1.4 million acres into protection. Now remember, RARE looked at millions of acres of Montana land. And here we're coming up with 850,000 acres, less than 1 million, for protection. So what do the environmentalists think of that in Montana? Didn't think much of it. What do the industry think? Oh my God, the sky is falling. So we came out here and talked to people, and we couldn't find anybody that liked it. Literally couldn't find anybody that liked it. You know, the people that knew about it the most, right? You stop a guy on the street and say, what do you think of it? Ah, hell, I don't know. And they're not paid to know, so it's okay. But the people that knew about it said, nope, this will never fly. And so we let it go. You know, you all don't want it, Congress won't do it. Not on something this close. And after all, you can see these lands out your kitchen windows. And you know those lands are yours. You give a damn about them. Especially if somebody comes up to you and says, Charlie, you see that view? They're about to allow roads and clear cut on it. Or, you see that view? They're never going to let you in there again. They're going to put it in wilderness. You'll never get in there. So, you know, misunderstandings and all the rest of it. So we didn't do anything with that one. In the meantime, I had put in and passed the Rattlesnake Wilderness Bill. So in 1986, the senior member of our delegation, Senator Melcher, called us together and said, let's do another bill. Let's get our staffs and let's sit down regularly and do another bill. So because I like to identify visually to you how these things work, visualize a nice wooden marble-top table. They treat members of Congress pretty good back there. The furniture is wonderful. Beautiful big oak table, about this big. Added onto that, right? About this big. And it was in the one of the Senate meeting rooms. And every, I think it was Thursday, Wednesday or Thursday, the delegation agreed to meet there and hammer out another bill, given what everybody had told us, both pro and con. And so we met every Wednesday. And we did it, there's no magic back, other than that, how do you pass a bill magic? The Congress works pretty commonly. We'd take an area, north of Yellowstone, for example, and we'd roll out the map. And we'd put, whatever, an ashtray on one end and a bust of Daniel Webster on the other, and we'd lay down the corners, and then we'd, Max and John and Ron and I would start in. And it would take us, 10, 15 days to figure one area. And we had the Forest Service make us overlays. So we'd take an overlay and put it on the map, and the overlay would say, okay, this was the last bill. And then we get markers and we'd change boundaries. We left out a creek. Well, we changed the boundary and put the creek in the wilderness. Or we put in a mountain that had roads on it. That's how we'll leave that mountain out. People go up there all the time. We'll leave that out of wilderness. So we redid it. And we did that every Wednesday or Thursday for a year. And we'd have the Forest Service specialists up there, and Melcher didn't want them in the room. So they had to sit outside. And maybe we'd talk to them during the hour or two, and maybe we wouldn't. When we all left, they'd leave. I always thought it was federal employee abuse, but they were sure helpful when we'd call them in. You know, we'd say, what in the hell is this? They'd say, well, that's a mine. Well, whose mine is it? And they'd know, because they knew what we were studying that day. And they'd tell us, and hasn't been used for so many years, but it is a mine. It does belong to somebody. And always Senator Melcher would say, we can't do that. We're not going to take somebody's private property. We're not going to take their road away. So we'd redraw the line. Might be a nice wilderness area, but as a miner once said to me, Pat, there's never been a mine without a spectacular view. So sometimes you have to decide, you're going to mine, you're going to have wilderness. We would take out private property like that and access to it every time we could find it, and the Forest Service was enormously helpful on that. Here's what we came up with. You remember the last bill was 850,000. This time we came up with 1.1 million acres of wilderness, 218,000 acres of national recreation, and then that 250,000 acres of set-aside, further study. We figured out 50,000 of it, but we couldn't figure out the other 200. We hadn't gotten in there enough. So we had 200,000 acres of further study. So we got it up to about 1.4 million or something. Not of wilderness, but of total protection. We brought it out here, and what did the environmentalists say? Too little. But you're making headway, boys. Keep moving. And of course, the corporations were, this war was going on big time. My favorite political sign of all time with regard to combat was a truck that came from Libby down through Missoula and turned around and went back. And it was a truck with logs on it. And it had an enormous tarp over it, tied down. And stenciled, or however they do it, on both sides of the tarp were the words, no more wolves, welfare, wilderness, or Williams. Isn't that awesome? Man, it was hard. It was tough. When I'd go to hearings, people would be out there with pickets one side or the other, and you knew you were in Montana. And then it went too far one day. I didn't think so, but the Secret Service did. I didn't have any Secret Service protection that I ever knew of, but some guys from the Secret Service called my secretary and said, we have to come in and see Mr. Williams about a problem in Montana over his safety. I said, okay. And so in these two guys came, and I thought they were pallbearers from Butte. They all dressed in black and had the white cuffs and the cufflinks, And I said, where are you going, fellas? I was trying to kid them. Are they off to a wedding, or what the hell are you doing? Mr. Williams, they're very serious guys. Mr. Williams, there's been an incident in Libby, and before we track it, we want you to know what we're doing. I said, okay. So they said, have you seen this? And they showed me 4 or 5 photographs. And I said, well, yeah, I saw it in the Libby paper. Somebody sent it to me when I was, faxed it to me or whatever. I said, yeah, I saw one version of it, and it was a crane, a really tall crane, then the cable coming down, and a guy strung up on the cable, a dummy, right? And he had a briefcase on it, and my bumper sticker was on the briefcase, Williams. Well, that was, according to the Secret Service, a direct threat. I tried to convince them that, oh, God, come on, guys, they do that outside of Butte bars every night. You know, they hang somebody in effigy. It's not a problem. No, it's a problem. And it was a problem because they thought they knew who was doing it. And while the company loaned the equipment, the consideration of the Secret Service, I never knew if it was true or not, was that some of those early forces from northern Idaho, the real far right, the dangerous right that's been driven out of northern Idaho now, had adherents in that Libby area and worked with them and put this sign up there. Well, the problem in northern Idaho was if they hung you in effigy, you were in trouble. And so they said, well, we're simply, we appreciate your humor and your understanding of this, but we want you to know we're going up and taking care of this. We won't arrest anybody. We'll tell them the next time, here are the laws they break. So they did. They went up, and it did calm things down in Libby because the word went around right away. But it was like that. It was difficult, mean, angry stuff. And frankly, the environmentalists who were relatively in support of these bills didn't know how to deal with any of that, nor did I. But there it was. It was just hard to defuse. That bill didn't go anywhere. Neither side liked it, and there was all this growing anger. And so I made a decision that this process, which is called consensus, where the 4 members would sit down over these tables and try to work it out, and then under the Melcher rules for consensus, all 4 members had to agree. Well, you know what that means. You head toward the lowest common denominator. You know, either I wouldn't like something, or Melcher wouldn't like it, or Baucus wouldn't like it. Marlene was kind of neither here nor there, and he wasn't pro-wilderness, but you know, he was kind of voting with the majority. Sometimes the majority would say, no, that's no good, we got to put that in or take that out. So the bills were less than they should have been because we had, in wilderness, in my opinion, because we had to have a consensus. So we had made 2 or 3 really good efforts at consensus, drawn up 2 major bills, took a long time, 3-4 years, and nobody liked them. So I called Melcher. I was out here probably campaigning, I don't know, or out here for one of those weekends where you get around and have meetings. And I decided, sort of on the plane out, to hell with this. This will never work. Consensus will never work. We got to do it the old-fashioned way. Each member of Congress has to figure out what the hell they want, tell their colleagues. If they can get their signature on it, fine. If they can't, put in a bill and try to get it passed. Let's vote. Let's not vote in quiet, in private at the table. Let's vote out front where Montanans can see us. And so, now if we'd drawn up these bills and got Montana's permission to move, then they'd have gone through this whole process that I described to you with subcommittees and so on. So when I say in secret, eventually the bill would have flown out into the open. But we were drawing it up kind of in secret, you know, only to get a bill, not for any other reason. I thought, no, so I called Melcher and I said, John, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to come to any more meetings. I'm going to drop my own bill and put it in the House. And he said, well, that's a mistake, Pat. We've got to come together on these things. And I told him why I didn't like it, lowest common denominator for areas and so on. And I called Max, and he said, oh, I think you're right. I think you're right. If you want to do it in the House, I'll do it in the Senate. Put in his own bill. And called Marlene, and he said, I don't give a damn what you do, Pat. That stuff's that's your stuff, not mine. So I came back and worked on a bill, and in 1987, I introduced a bill, consensus ended, and here's what I had. 1.3 million acres of wilderness, 350,000 acres of national recreation area, and my staff and I and the Forest Service found some more areas that we didn't know what to do with, so I had 350,000 acres of those. So I was getting up around 2 million acres of protected areas, but 1.3 million in wilderness alone. The first remember now, the first consensus bill of the delegation had a total in the 3 areas: further study, national, recreation area, special management, I think we call it, and wilderness, had a total of 1.3. So I was putting in 1.3 by myself. I had I think 3-4 hearings on it, 3 or 4 in Montana and 1 back in Washington. And lo and behold, it passed the House. Got it through the subcommittee, got it through full committee, got it through the House. Baucus, in the meantime, about the same time, had a bill that was very similar to mine. He didn't move it through the Senate because I was a little ahead of him in introducing my bill and getting action on it, so he waited for my bill to come over and then tried to move my bill with amendments through the Senate, but it couldn't go anywhere. If both members of the Senate, if they disagree about wilderness, it's really tough on the Senate. Same thing in the House. The Senate is statewide. 2 members represent the same people statewide. In the House, you just represent a district. Now it happens in Montana because there's so few people. To get a district, you got to have the whole state because of people, right? So you're like I said, you have raw power in the House if you're from a small state like Montana. But in the Senate, that's not true. And Melcher was reluctant to support the bill, so it stayed there and died. In the meantime, the industries decided, yeah, something's going to happen here. We may not like it. We better get in this game. And so the Wood Products Association came out with a bill, a proposal for wilderness. That was, now these are the corporations that are fighting us to beat hell and hanging me in effigy and with help and putting enormous amounts of money into ads and into meetings and into log halls, as they call them, that said no more wolves, wilderness, Williams, and welfare, right? They're putting an enormous amount of money, but lo and behold, they said, hey, something's going to happen here. Plus, it's not really costing any jobs. We got to quit saying that, they said. It's not really going to cost jobs. So they came up with a bill for about 1 million acres of wilderness. Astonishing. And to this day, I know some lumber people who say, well, it's not true. We didn't come up with that bill, but they did. They came up with a proposal in 1988 that had 950,000 acres of wilderness and did not include the Rocky Mountain Front, which the wood products people were for putting in wilderness, but it was oil and gas country. And they wanted the oil and gas guys to decide that, corporations and the Congress to decide that. They didn't want to be pushing something that didn't have trees on it, in effect. Well, that was an enormous break for the corporations. They're suddenly say, this fight isn't worth it. We really can do this. I got a call. Again, I was in Montana, and I got a call from Senator Melcher not too long after my bill passed the House and died in the Senate, but the next session. And he said, Pat, the meeting will be on Thursday at such and such a time. What meeting? He said, well, the consensus meeting for wilderness. We all have to agree on a wilderness bill if we're going to get it through. Well, what do you do? I mean, if I'd have said that to him, if he'd have passed a bill through the Senate, and I'd have said, I'm going to stop this in the House, I want to do it my way, he'd have to have done it. So there we were. Plus, he was the senior senator, and you have this tradition of respect. So I said, okay. So we go back to this table in the same room. This is 8 years after the first effort. And in August of 1988, which is 2 years after my bill, or about a year and a half, we came up with another bill, the 4 of us. 1.4 million acres of wilderness. 325,000 acres national recreation and 350,000 acres of further study. So now we're over 2 million. Now, my point of giving you those numbers, and I'm sorry I'm not putting them down here anywhere, where it didn't have handouts for you. I thought about it, but trust me, they're confusing. All students say fewer handouts and less stuff up on the board. Okay, at least that's what they tell me. The reason I tell you this is because in the chart in your mind, as you've been hearing about how much wilderness the delegation has agreed to try to get into law over the almost a decade, you see it's doing this. The amount of wilderness is doing this all the time on a graph. It's going up. Why is it going up? You. Delegation come out here and people say, you know, John, you know, Max, you know, Pat, this battle's not worth it. You guys shouldn't be fighting over this. You should all agree to have more wilderness than you have. It's the Montana tradition. It's where we're going economically. People are starting to get it now, right? Probably got it long before the Congress. You ought to have more wilderness. And we heard that all the time. Now, I know, some corporations still say the polls show Montanans don't want wilderness. Yeah, 19% of them. 19% of them. Rest of them say, yeah, we need more wilderness. And that's how it was when we were there. Not in the very beginning, but as people studied it and heard about it and read, heard from the groups, pro and con, they began to say, yeah, come on, this isn't. So that guy that operated that shovel in the Berkeley pit, Bobby, he gave me a call. He called me about 8 o'clock his time, 10 o'clock in Washington. Hi, Pat, this is Bobby. Hey, Bobby, how you doing? He said, pretty good. He said, you know, I called you, I guess he said the last time you were out, or a few times, and you were in Butte, he said, you and I had a beer together, and he said, I told you the guys at the Met were raising hell about you. Now, these are all guys who work for the mining company, the Anaconda Company in the Berkeley pit. They're really raising hell about you, Pat. They think you've abandoned them. But yeah, I said, well, should I be worried about it? Should I go in there and bring it up? And, oh, I wouldn't do that, Pat. He said, some of it's joking, but some of it's pretty serious. And I'm just afraid you're going to lose help when you're running again. Okay. So this night he called me and he said, Pat, you remember I told you you were catching hell down there? And I said, yeah. He said, well, that's kind of stopped. He said, old Ed came in again last Friday night. Well, old Ed was a guy with a dirty straw hat who came in every Friday around 5:30. And he sat about in the middle of the Met Tavern. The Met is a bar across from the Civic Center, if you know where that is in Butte. And he never said a word. We thought maybe he couldn't speak, seriously. She'd never say, how you doing, Ed? And when the bartender came up, they knew what he wanted, and they just give it to him. He'd never order it, and he'd have one shot and one beer, and he'd get up and leave. He'd leave the money, leave a tip, and leave, but never said a word. He said, I got news for you. He said, Ed spoke. What the hell he did? Yep. What did he say? He said, well, you're going to like this. It's the reason the boys have quit talking about you. He said a couple of guys were really on you. God damn it, Bobby, we elect your brother-in-law and he won't listen. Every goddamn wilderness bill he comes out with has got more acreage in it, and we're trying to, make a living around here, and he's trying to lock up all this land. And he said, Ed said, and I won't quote it precisely, he said, Ed said, shut the up. Ed can speak. So we all looked down at him, and he said he took a little sip of the beer, and he said, listen, boys, I've been coming in here this way for 16 years. And I know I don't say much, but I listen. And the only thing I've ever heard you guys talk about, he said, I've never heard you guys talk about liking your jobs. He said, you all work for that goddamn company, which is what we called the Anaconda Company in those days. Gave us jobs, but talk about that company. You don't do that. I never hear you say what a wonderful thing it is to work in the deep mines or down in the pit. Never hear you say a word about it. What you talk about is you're hunting and fishing where you got your elk. That big hole you know about down in the big hole you won't tell anybody about. You brought in a couple of fish this year. That's what you talk about. Pat Williams is trying to save the only thing you give a shit about. Get off his back. Said he shut up. Threw his shot down and his beer down, and he said there hasn't been one whisper in that place. Anti-Wilderness or anti-Williams, because that guy had a piece of brilliance he wanted to share with them about what they were about as people, as citizens of Montana, as recreators. Plus, neither I or anybody else were taking their jobs. We weren't going to do that. Be a long time before they put the Berkeley Pit in Wilderness, I'll tell you. Speaking of the Berkeley Pit, by the way, somebody said to me, how long is that going to continue to fill up? And the answer is as long as it continues to rain. Yeah. So your kids' 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 kids, they're going to have it, and they're going to have the cost of it. They continue to pull water out of it so it doesn't reach a certain level. But they can't drain it because it rains, right? And those thousands of miles of tunnel just dump water in the Berkeley Pit because it's downhill, and it's an outlet. Forget where it was. We sat down at the table. We worked this thing through. We had 1,004 acres of wilderness. We were all set to go with it. And there was a nice guy, a radio announcer from Billings, and a stockyard auctioneer named Conrad Burns. Conrad's still alive, by the way. He had a stroke, the poor fella, and he's a little disabled, but not bad. He shows up with his friends and has coffee somewhere down in the Billings at a coffee shop. And here he's still full of hell and got a great sense of humor, but he's in a chair and lost a lot of weight. I hope he's okay. Conrad was running against John Melcher, and this bill became the subject of the bill passed. This omnibus bill passed. Both the House and Senate finally got a bill passed. Conrad's running against John. And suddenly the bill, wilderness, became the focal point of the campaign. And moneyed people and moneyed corporations, I guess bless their hearts, they've done well, decided we can get a seat in the United States Senate. And it was close like it is this time. We can start peeling away these Democrats. We can get this seat. So money flooded in here for Conrad unexpectedly. And John was getting a lot of money too, but his opponent for the first time was matching him. And it was only about wilderness. And enormous amounts of the money were coming from the natural resource sector of the economy, those corporations and people. And I was out in Montana again and happened to be in Missoula. It sounds like I was in Missoula every hour I came out here. I wasn't. I was all over the state, at least western Montana in the early days, until we lost our member of Congress, other member. I was out here and the phone rang. And it was very early and I was off to a morning Kiwanis or a morning Rotary meeting in Missoula. Yeah, a lot of nice people. And the phone rang and I picked it up. It was a guy named Art Noonan. Some of you know Artie. He was back there and he was my natural resources specialist. He's a whiz at it. And he said, Pat, have you heard the news? And I said, no. And he said, Reagan vetoed the bill. And I said, Art, Jesus, I'm in a hurry here. What's going on? Because Art was kind of a practical joker. He said, no, Pat, I'm sincere about this. You're going to be asked about this if you haven't seen the paper yet. Reagan vetoed the bill. I said, no president has ever vetoed a wilderness bill. We knew that. He said, well, they have now. I said, holy crap. So I did the Kiwanis and a lot of other things and went back. Well, I was out here. The session had ended and I was out here The session had ended, so we couldn't get back to veto, to override the veto. It was a pocket veto. Right? Good wilderness bill. And it had the three of us. Marlene wouldn't join, but it had the three of us on the bill. 2 senators, and then I introduced it in the House. We got it, we got it through all that subcommittee stuff, both things, sent it down to the president, and he vetoed it. And then about, my recollection is less than a week later, as the end of the campaigns, I was running too, but the focus wasn't on me, it was on the Senate race, as it usually is if there's a Senate race. Senators have more authority than members of the House because there are only 100 senators and 435 of us. The House has a hell of a lot of authority, but each individual member. So Senate races are really important. And about a week after the veto, you couldn't turn on television without seeing Ronald Reagan in a place that looked like the Oval Office, but legally it couldn't have been because you can't campaign from the Oval Office. And Reagan, who probably was the best, one can argue whether he was a good president, great president, bad president, whatever, but he was probably the best president, except for Jack Kennedy, on television. He was terrific on TV. He had those actor skills, he was good looking, he appeared to resonate, and he was real. And he came on with that thing he does about, oh gosh, what's happened to Montana? We got to veto a wilderness bill. Now the reason I did that, I've been to Montana many times, you're all my friends, and the reason I did it was because that bill came through the Congress at the last minute. Most Montanans didn't even know there were a wilderness bill. Well, Jesus, if anybody read the paper, they'd known it for 10 years. And it was done suddenly, out of sight, when you weren't paying attention. Well, a hell of a lot of people don't pay attention to this stuff. So they're watching TV and their heroes on, and they're like, boy, no kidding. I didn't know this was going to happen. Now the president's telling me about it. I got to listen. And so I vetoed this on your behalf. And let me tell you, this will never happen again if you'll do one thing for me. If you'll vote for Conrad Burns for the United States Senate. And they did. And Melcher was defeated. And Burns won. Just only because of that? No. But that put it over the edge. That put it over the edge. Conrad worked like hell, had a lot of money, nice guy, all the rest of it. People were a little tired of John. I'm not sure they should have been, but they were. They didn't think he was coming home enough and all that sort of thing. But that Reagan showing up with that really folksy stuff, to save us from ourselves, he vetoed the bill. That was a killer. So down it went. I guess I had passed 4 or 5 or 6 bills out of the House by then. Most of them got bottled up in the Senate, one thing or another. But I still decided I should stick around back there. I was missing Montana a lot, but I thought, nah, I got to stay around for a few more terms. And so I did, and I was introducing other wilderness bills that most of which would have the same fate. I'd get them through, and most of them came out at about 1.6, 1.7, up to 2 million acres of protected land, my bills that I would do myself. And Melcher was gone. By the way, Conrad put in a bill, one of the first bills he put in when he got back there, he put in a bill for 850,000 acres of wilderness, so almost a million. 850,000 acres of wilderness, and the corporate far right went against him like that. So what in the hell do you think we elected you for? But he had looked at it and said, wait a minute, this isn't going to cost any jobs. We're protecting places here. So Conrad developed some sense of this and some sense about how this economy was changing. Now his 850,000 was a long way off the mark because by then we were up to 1.4 million, 1.5 million proposed wilderness. But he was in the game, right? He was trying, to his credit. Baucus and I were putting in bills for considerably more. Conrad finally, by the way, introduced a bill for 1.1 million acres of wilderness a few years later in his terms. And so, he was being relatively helpful, or I thought he was. And I want to get to the end here. Oh, by the way, in Missoula there was a group called, what do they call it, Rocky Mountain Alliance, the Alliance for Wild Rockies Alliance. Fine group, wanted lots and lots of wilderness, way more than the delegation thought we could get passed, and we thought way more than Montanans would agree to. But the Alliance for the Wild Rockies was moving everything toward more and more and more wilderness. And the politics got pretty rough, because here I've got, and the delegation has, you know, the mining industry and the rest of it on one side trying to, even though they had come up with proposals, they were beaten up on our proposals on the right, political right. Now we had the Alliance for the Wild Rockies kicking the hell out of us on the left. You don't have enough wilderness. The Alliance for the Rockies, however, had a wonderful idea. And now it's obvious to everybody, and we owe it, at least in Montana, to the Wild Rockies Alliance. And that is, they said, you can't stop at a state line. You got to put in bills in concert, for example, with members of Congress in Idaho. Let's take, for example, the Great Burn. Montana, you got to put our side of the Great Burn in wilderness, and then the other side, which is pretty sheer cliffs, is in Idaho. You got to get the Idaho delegation to agree to put that in, because, as I said before to you, the deer and the elk can't read. I don't know when the hell they're in Idaho and they're no longer safe, right? So we've got to get rid of this problem of state lines, and we got to recognize migration routes. We got to treat the animals as they live. And it's simple stuff, but at the time I thought, God, they're right. And I started to try to change my wilderness to comport more with this thing about not violating, not having lines violate logic. So you can't imagine the good stuff you're missing here. It's not true, but some of my students thought some of this stuff I'm skipping was pretty good. Let me jump to just before I left. There were other bills introduced, and it was the same old thing. It got a little boring. You know, it just kind of got boring. I introduced a bill toward the end of my time. I left in 96, so I got there in 79, and then I was no longer a congressman in 97, because you go until January 20th when the new Congress is sworn in, right? So I guess in 95 or 96, I thought, I'm going to keep trying. We might get this done. By the way, this wasn't the only thing I was doing in Congress. Somebody sent me a roll one time I was so proud of it, of big letters, the 20 or 30 bills that I got passed that may have made some difference in Montana, including the rattlesnake and the Lee Metcalf wilderness down there north of Yellowstone. We had kind of convinced ourselves maybe we shouldn't be doing statewide bills. And by statewide bills, I mean that. I know you can't see it real well, but can you see the, I wish I had a pointer, can you see this one, the checkered area up there? Yeah. Well, that's existing wilderness, wherever that is. And that, of course, that big swatch up there is the Bob Marshall complex. Okay. The green, the heavy green, is proposed wilderness, that are bills. So all this stuff I'm telling you, that's the heavy green. And the light green is released. In other words, the light, all of this was in, except the current wilderness, all of the other colors were in the rare, the proposal, and the released part of rare is the light green. So here right on the corner below Red Rocks Lake and Dillon, you see a heavy green thing, and then around it you see light green. The light green is what would have been released. And Ms. Bruce here, who drove up for Dillon for this, was responsible for that heavy green. That came late, as I recall, Louise, in the wilderness process, but that's the centennials, right? And that was you and your friends that managed to get that in the bill. So that's it. The checkered is current. The dark green, and there's not a lot of it, is what caused the wilderness fight. Most of it's around the Bob Marshall. And you see where it says Bob Marshall? I know it's not clear. That's the that's the Rocky Mountain front. And so the dark green is what I and others at different times, these are really my bills, but Baucus and I were pretty much in agreement with all this. That's what I'm talking to you about. So when I say a statewide wilderness bill, it means we dealt with all of those areas. And you can see all of them are in western Montana. We dealt with all of those areas in every bill, except twice. Once when we said, let's maybe just pick out an area and do it by itself, the rattlesnake, bang, we passed it. Let's get another one. We'll name it after Lee, who had just passed away a few years earlier, Lee Metcalf. So we got this area down near Yellowstone, that northern rim country down there, and we put that in wilderness, and that's called the Lee Metcalf. But otherwise, we were dealing with trying to do everything in one bill. And people say, well, why did you do that? Well, that's what every state did. That's the way Congress got its wilderness, so that it didn't have to come back 40 times with individual bills, you see. By the way, the Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, finally said to me toward the end of this process, I said, I'm going to go again, Mr. Speaker, I want us to try to pass another bill. And he held up his hand and said, no, this was probably in 91 or 2. He said, nope, you've taken enough time in the House, Pat. I know you've gotten it done several times. Let the Senate go first. We're not going to consider any more Montana wilderness bills. We've been spending all our time on it, and time's money. So those are the areas. So I tried once more. Not long before I left, and I came up with a bill. Let's see. I came up with a bill that had, in the mid-90s, I think, that had well, not easily finding it, I'm sorry. But it had about 1.5 million acres. And overall protected 2 million, or a little over 2 million, but about 1.5 or 6 million acres. Got it through the House again, got it over to the Senate with an understanding that the Senate would pass it from Conrad Burns. Senate will pass it, Pat. You bring it over. It wasn't passed, it wasn't passed, it wasn't passed, and there was 1 day left before adjournment. And I went over to see Conrad. I walked over there and couldn't find him, and then finally found him. And he said, we're bringing it up tonight. It's okay, hip hip. Last night of the session, but we're bringing it up. And several times I brought up bills over there, and a senator would put a hold on it. You know, if you want to kill something in the Senate, you don't have to have a filibuster. You can go up to the parliamentarian and whisper to him and say, I want a bill, I want to hold on this bill that came over from the House or a bill in the Senate. I want to hold on H.R. 1614 by Williams. And they'll mark it down, they put it in a drawer and lock it. And nobody knows who has a hold on the bill, but the bill doesn't move. It's a horrible rule in the Senate. But every senator wants the power, so including Tester and Walsh and Baucus, and none of them would ever be against that. And Now that I look back on it, I think maybe it was my job to tell people, you know what they're doing over there in the Senate? And embarrass them into doing it. But you're a colleague, right? You don't want to do that sort of thing. But talk about undemocratic. So I passed several bills to the Senate prior to this that just had holes put on them, and they couldn't go anywhere. So Conrad assured me not this time. And so the bill goes over to the Senate, and the last day comes up, and Baucus brings the bill to the floor with Conrad sitting there ready to speak. And it was midnight. And after this bill, the last bill on the calendar, they were going to adjourn. And Customato from New York wandered onto the floor and grabbed the microphone and said, Senator Baucus, will you yield? And Baucus said, well, I'd like to finish this bill, I'll tell the senator from New York. And the senator from New York said, well, you know, if that happens, the members have a promise that they can go home as soon as this bill is voted on. And then he said, I won't have a chance to say what I need to say. And Baucus said, well, is it about the bill? And D'Amato said, no, it's about another matter. But I can assure the senator that if possible, I will release the time to him when I'm done, if possible. And Max made a mistake. He said, all right, I yield time to the senator from New York. And Customato announced that he was going to talk for a week if it took, because the president had canceled the contract to build, I think, wings on a fighter jet, and the wings were being built in upstate New York. And D'Amato was trying to protect the workers up there. So he said, as soon as I get a message on the floor from the president, I'm going to keep talking. Well, by then, Clinton was asleep. He'd gone to bed. It was 1 in the morning or something. I said, no, nobody's going to wake the president for this. So D'Amato kept talking and talking and talking and talking around 2:30, 3 o'clock. I said to Baucus, we all got to go home, Max. We're sorry. And D'Amato yielded it to a senator he trusted, and the senator moved that the Senate adjourned sine die. The gavel fell, and the bill was dead again. That was the last time I could offer it, because then I was on my way home. So Pauline is still tied to the railroad tracks, and the train's still coming. Since I left, there has been no effort to get another wilderness bill until Senator Tester, bless his heart, has a wilderness bill that not everybody supports, but what the hell, everybody hasn't ever supported every wilderness bill that's come along. Everyone doesn't support these. And there are some things in the Tester bill I'd change if I could, but again, so what? That bill has languished in the Senate now for almost a Senate term, despite Max and John Walsh and Tester's best efforts. So who knows when this problem will end? Questions?
On your slide projector display, if you could single out 1 or 2 proposed wilderness areas on there.
Yeah.
Top wilderness, what would you say would be your number 1, number 2?
Right. Well, Carol and I have 2 daughters and a son. I'm not sure which one I can let go. I feel I've been in all these areas and done 18 years of work. I don't know. I think we got to expand those areas in the Bob Marshall. I think we need to do that for sure. The Pintlers are one of my favorite places, and I think we could do something there. But I can't really pick a favorite. If you're suggesting that the Congress go back to getting a few, doing the best they can, then that is what that's what Senator Tester's trying to do. That green area up north, he's put a lot of that in. He's taken some areas down here in the southern part and put those in, and then he's gone up against the Bob Marshall and wants to put some of those areas in. So, but he's trading it for some logging. And that's what some people, it's the first time to my knowledge that would be done in Senate or House legislation. So, but the good side of trading it for logging is he also takes out all the old, or almost all the old logging roads. So I think cost is part of the reason that his bill doesn't pass, because he's got more in it than just wilderness, which isn't that costly. Yes.
Your background or education as a teacher, and if you assume that this has been a group of middle schoolers in this room, would you please define the word untrammeled?
The word untrammeled. Yeah, you're asking me to do something nobody's ever been able to do. Zonauer, the early wilderness advocate and the guy who really wrote the real wilderness bills for the Congress, or worked with them to write it. What was Zonauer's first name? Howard. Died a couple of months before Lyndon Johnson signed the bill. Worked 20 years to get a bill and figure out how to do it, and then died just before it was signed into law in '64. Zonauer came up with the word untrammeled, and he got it, if my memory is correct, from reading Bob Marshall's diary. And the word untrammeled, meaning whatever the hell it means, was come up by, was a Bob Marshall word. Maybe he wasn't the first, but that's where Zonauer got it. Heavy footprints, permanent structures, digging, and I might add noise, disturbs wilderness. And if we're going to leave it untrammeled, we can't do those things. Yeah. Anyone else? Sir?
The question, untrammeled also means uncontrolled or wild, unrestrained. The question, when you were working on the Rare 2 bill, I was working on a Rare 2 bill in Utah, and we had an all-Republican delegation. And I think they went through a process like you were describing, where they all sat around the table together and came up with boundaries that they released to the public. But during that process, Congressman Seiberling,
Yeah, John Seiberling, Ohio.
he insisted that they constantly be improving the bill. He wouldn't, as long as conservationists were screaming bloody murder about what the Utah delegation was doing, he kept insisting they improve it, or he wouldn't let it through the House.
Yep.
And I wonder if you ever got any of that pressure from Seiberling to respond to the complaints of conservationists that the bill wasn't good enough.
John Seiberling was chairman of he was Seiberling Tires, by the way. His family was Seiberling Tires. And John was a wonderful, gentle, very, very bright guy, and as determined and stubborn as you can be. John was chairman of the committee that dealt with wilderness. It's had different names through the years, but he was chairman of that subcommittee. And he had a lot of seniority on the full committee. Its chairman was Morris Udall. And Seiberling and Udall were like this. So you had the two chairmen absolutely together. And Seiberling was much harsher, gentle guy, but I mean he was harsher than Udall. Udall would try to cajole you into doing things. Seiberling would simply say, Pat, your last bill didn't meet muster. I want to hear your bills. Montana's extraordinarily important in this process and has always been. But I'm going to be very faint-hearted about you and your bills if they don't always have a little more wilderness. People are asking for more. So yeah, he was as heavy-handed as a gentle guy can be. They weren't all gentle back there. John really knew his stuff. Yep. Mo Udall said and John was even more of an environmentalist than Mo was. John was like a purist. Whatever the hell that means, but right, that's how he was. And Udall said I said I have a carpenter friend and I had him make me a little house. And he said, I bring it to any fundraisers that I'm having if some of the corporate guys come to the fundraisers. And because he was chairman of the whole Natural Resources Committee, the timber industry and the oil and gas industry would make a perfunctory visit, and they'd leave him a little bit of money, right? Give his opponent more, but they'd leave him a little bit. And he'd always say, have you seen my house? And in the beginning, afterwards, you know, when they got to know what it was, they'd just laugh and say, well, show us again. But in the beginning, what it was his little house, all framed in, looked like a little miniature house, and the chimney was up here right above, sort of above the front door. And you could pull the chimney up and the front door would swing open. And right behind the front door was a photograph of John Seiberling staring out. He'd say, the timber guys will come up and I'll say, you better hope I win this election, because if I don't, here's the new chairman of the full committee. Pop! Turn him white. Anybody else? We're a little late, but I'm okay, but I don't want to cut somebody off. No? Let me tell you how much I appreciate you coming in, particularly those of you who avoided this wonderful day outside to come inside. Again, appreciate Molly and the University of Montana, and particularly the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center, which you have to remember, when I asked Mike for permission, he said, nope. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.